Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Susan LYLIS, Executive Vice President of the ICCF Group, and I wish to welcome our expert panelists, members of Congress who will be joining us, congressional staff, representatives from foreign embassies in DC, special guests observing, including Honorable Nixon Chilangwa, Provincial Minister for Luapula Province in Zambia, and founding co-chair of the Zambia Parliamentary Conservation Caucus, representatives from the Ministry of Culture, Tourism, and Environment in Angola, Dr. Kanga from the Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife in Kenya, and all others joining us on Zoom and live stream. Today's virtual U.S. congressional staff briefing will highlight the impact that COVID-19 and the resulting global economic shutdown are having on conservation and conservation-dependent communities across Africa. During the next hour, we will hear from experts on the ground in Africa's parks and conservation areas who are experiencing the real impact that this pandemic is having across the continent. They will provide insight into the challenges facing vulnerable communities, and they will address how policy considerations must take into account national security and livelihood concerns. Moderating today's panel is EDWIN TAMBARA, Director of External Relations at the African Wildlife Foundation. EDWIN will offer a brief overview of the conversation, introduce the panelists, and then we'll call on them to each speak for several minutes. Once the panelists have finished, we will begin a question and answer period, where questions will be taken from Zoom as well as live stream. If you're on the Zoom call and wish to ask a question, please raise your hand or chat privately with me to let me know that you have a question. In the chat, please identify both your name and your office. If you're joining via live stream on YouTube, please also identify your name and office when submitting your question. Please try to direct your question to one of our panelists by name. If we're not able to address your question due to time constraints, we will convey them to the panelists for response later. We may have some members of Congress joining as their schedules permit, and we'll recognize them accordingly. So now, thank you all, and Edwin, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Welcome to everyone. As Susan has introduced, we are thankful for this opportunity. We are experiencing unprecedented impact of COVID across the world. This pandemic is affecting all aspects of our life. This Friday, on a virtual call of the African Union Leaders Summit, President Cyril Ramaphosa voiced what African leaders have been voicing for the last 2 months, that it is impossible to simultaneously address and service debts and provide budgets for things that need to be attended to, given the increase in health costs because of this pandemic. And certainly when you hear our leaders talking in that way, in the conservation sector, we also ask the question, what does this mean for us? Because as we know, due to other pressing concerns, conservation is always and is often on the list of priorities for government. So even when there are constraints coming from this pandemic, where does that leave conservation? So today we have a list of panelists who are going to help us understand the situation as it is on the ground, but also help answer some questions that we may have in terms of how can we make sure that as leaders are discussing around issues of resources and policy decisions, how can we ensure that conservation is also on their priority list, as we have seen the indications that the source of this virus could well come from wildlife. So this has implications in terms of how we move forward managing our wildlife, and how wildlife interfaces with people. So today I have 4 experts panelists coming from Africa, starting with Professor Lee, who is the Minister of Water, Forests, Environment, also responsible for climate change, sustainable development goals, and land use planning in Gabon. Welcome, Minister Lee. We also have SAMMWANDHA, who is the Executive Director of Uganda Wildlife Authority. They oversee all the national parks and wildlife in Uganda. Sam, welcome. We have Dickson KAELO, who is the CEO of Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, which is the umbrella body for conservancies in Kenya. Dickson, welcome to the conversation. And we have SHAMINI JAYANATHAN, who is a criminal barrister, world law expert, and independent consultant based in Kenya. So these 4 experts are gonna cover different aspects representing different constituencies within conservation. And we'll, in a few minutes, we'll hear each of them will present a brief presentation to us, really representing the key issues they are seeing on the ground and they are facing on the ground related to some of the constituencies they represent. But in a way, what they are going to talk about reflects what's happening in most parts of Africa. So we hope we can get a window to understanding what's happening on the ground. So without further ado, I'll start and hand over to Minister Lee, where you can give us your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to ICCF for organizing this low carbon event. Good to see you, Susan, David, and it's been a while, but it's great to see Nick Lapham on this call. Research catalyzed in response to the Ebola outbreaks in Africa has shown that coronaviruses and other potentially pathogenic viruses are ubiquitous in wildlife, both in tropical and also in temperate regions. Mostly this isn't a concern, but when wildlife species that don't usually mix are brought into contact, viruses can jump hosts and recombine into highly pathogenic novel forms, such as SARS, MERS, or the current novel coronavirus. The animals carrying the new virus must then come into contact with humans. The current pace of human disruption of ecosystems provides the perfect storm for this chain of events, which has been rare in the past. Logging operations bring injured canopy species crashing down into contact with terrestrial predators and humans. The centers of intensely unnatural remixing of live species and humans, such as wet markets, obviously increase risks immeasurably. Whilst it is simple to understand the knee-jerk reaction to the obvious risk that wildlife wet markets pose, it is important for the global community to grasp that there are still many people in the world who rely on wildlife hunting and trading for survival. Most are law-abiding people living subsistence livelihoods who are often economically fragile. They need support to survive and live safely. The issue in front of us, briefly, is this: immediate outlawing of wildlife hunting and trade that supports subsistence will put intolerable short-term pressure on such communities and force them into illegal action simply to survive. However, if people continue to hunt and trade wildlife without proper regulation, it is likely that deadly zoonotic diseases will continue to emerge into human populations. We need to find local solutions that will enable subsistence communities to move away from hunting and trading practices that put themselves wildlife, and ultimately the global population at risk. To achieve a long-term goal of securing rural food security without reliance on wildlife, we need to invest in stronger rural supply chains, better health of domestic food production and distribution, and wider access to domestic food production. In the shorter term, we need to ensure hunting practices safeguard public health by identifying high-risk species whose hunting should be controlled or banned, regulating legal hunting and ranching to promote sustainability, and ensure the same public health standards as for farmed meat, whilst eradicating illegal trafficking. Building perfect environmental governance for rural Africa will take time. Right now, Africa is urbanizing fast, but unlike in many more developed nations, subsistence skills and access to common lands are still widespread. Economic downturns, environmental disasters, and conflicts temporarily and locally reverse the urbanization trend, bringing people back into their villages and increasing their reliance on subsistence livelihoods and hunting. It is not yet clear which countries will see a rise in rural populations and increased hunting through necessity, and which may see a rejection of wildlife trade and a reduction in hunting. Under either scenario, investment in sustainable, local, environmentally friendly food production will put countries in a more resilient position in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. We'll move to the next presenter. Sam, do you want to?
Yes, thank you very much. I was waiting to get unmuted, which I am now. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. I work with Uganda Wildlife Authority, the equivalent of the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's a pleasure for us to be sharing what impacts we are having here because of COVID-19. In terms of impacts in Uganda, but which impacts also all over Africa. As you may be aware, there is a lockdown in most of our countries. And when this was announced, many of the city flocks traveled back to their villages because many Africans come from villages and they only travel to work in towns. And so many have traveled back there and have combined with the village flocks and are trying to find a living where they are. Now, for them to survive there, they either have to deal and do agriculture activities or participate in something illegal. And because most of our protected areas are found in the village settings, we are having a lot of pressure in terms of poaching, in terms of encroachment, and in terms of illegal wildlife trade. And in Uganda, for example, we have seen this increase in the last 2 months by about 20%. An increased poaching, illegal wildlife trade, has an increased risk of zoonotic diseases in human population, as the Honorable Minister has already mentioned. So it is really an issue that we need to bear in mind as we work towards addressing the pandemic, but also the other impacts that it has brought to wildlife conservation. Many natural conservation agencies in Africa depend on tourism revenue for them to be able to operate. Now, because of the lockdown, tourism revenues have gone to zero. For example, for us in Uganda, we are receiving on average $2 million as Uganda Wildlife Authority, which money we stopped earning at the beginning of March, and which money we were putting back into operations in terms of dealing with encroachment, with illegal wildlife trade, but also dealing with human-wildlife conflict management and supporting community livelihoods. And then the capital developments that enable us to operate better. This loss of income means that the services that we offer are also lost. And unfortunately, many of the agencies in Africa cannot entirely depend on government because the resources they provide are limited. And with COVID, the taxes have also reduced, and therefore governments are cutting their expenditure. Again, I'll give an example in Uganda, the National Forest Authority, which is similar to the US Forest Service, received only money for salaries without operations for the period of April, June. And so they are stuck. They cannot address the challenges they find because they cannot operate. The other aspect is what are the impacts of COVID on the local communities. In many of the areas where we work, because of the tourism, the communities are also losing revenue because the markets for their products is gone. They cannot sell their crafts, they can't sell food items. Some of them have lost jobs in lodges, as porters, as drivers, as guides. And this has a big impact on their livelihoods, which also means that they are part and parcel of those who might end up being poachers or involved in illegal wildlife trade. Now, for the conservation agencies, our priorities given the COVID-19 is to ensure that we maintain a minimum amount of operation to address the protection of the wildlife, but also to address the human-wildlife conflict, because you might be aware that many parks in Africa don't have fences, and so the wildlife moves out of the park. In the next thing you know, it's damaging somebody's crops or even eating livestock. And so we need to see how to focus on that. As an agency, Uganda Wildlife Authority has already developed a contingency plan that is guiding us in how we move forward. I know that other agencies in other African countries are also working towards that, so that if they have some limited revenue available, they use that for the bare minimum of operations. At Uganda Wildlife Authority, we had, over the last 2 financial years, been able to save some revenue because our revenues exceeded expenditure. That is what we have put in our contingency plan, and we hope to be able to work at half capacity for the next 12 months. So we already have something in plan, but the resources are not adequate. And therefore, that's why we are sharing this information with partners, with whoever is able to assist, to provide that assistance. I must end by indicating that as Uganda Wildlife Authority, we might be in a better position than many agencies in Africa that entirely depend on their governments to run. And if they do, then they probably can only keep jobs of their staff and unfortunately unable to do any operations. So any support given to agencies to protect these wildlife and prevent the possibility of another epidemic coming out of zoonotic diseases is most welcome. I thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for that presentation, very insightful. I would just like to thank Congressman David Joyce from Ohio for joining us, co-chair of the International Conservation Caucus. Thank you, Congressman. And now, Edwin, back to you.
Thank you, Susan. Now, thank you very much, Sam, for that overview in terms of what's happening with protected area agencies across the continent, but with some really interesting figures coming out of Uganda as well. So now we'll move on to hear from Dickson, who is going to give us an overview on what's happening with communities, conservancies, as well as tourism. Dickson, over to you.
Thank you very much, Edwin, and thank you very much, ICCF, for this opportunity for us to share our experiences. I lead a conservation network of community and private conservancies in Kenya. And I grew up at the age of Masai Mara National Reserve in the 1970s, where conservation among our communities sounded like a bad contest between the local communities and the wildlife authorities. Through my early life, I saw both communities lose livestock to predators, and predators being poisoned in retaliation. This was true in my village, elsewhere in Kenya, and most parts of Africa. 3 decades later, community conservation as practiced in many parts of Africa has made significant strides in changing the situation. In my 20 years working with frontline communities, success stories are all over, where indigenous and local communities are stewards supporting government efforts to conserve wildlife and creating economic opportunities for themselves. And tourism has played a very critical role in the growth of these conservancies. Communities derive income through conservation areas, they said, through participation in activities, in cultural activities. And this income has been key in reversing the previous tension between communities and wildlife. And we see now in many places in Africa where communities are working hand in hand with protected areas authorities to protect wildlife and not antagonizing each other. In Kenya, for example, today we have 160 of such conservancies, which has really doubled the area under conservation management by adding more than 15 million acres. And this has involved more than 5 million people spread across nearly all the counties in our country. Most of these areas are relatively underserved by infrastructure, by government services, and these conservancies have played a role in securing peace and security, in promoting stability, and also in creating job opportunities and economic empowerment. And again, I think the USAID foreign assistance has really played a key role in the development of these conservancies, representing over 20 years of investment by USAID in Kenya, for which we are very grateful for. Now, with COVID-19, this pandemic has brought to halt tourism, and therefore undermining years of work, wildlife recoveries, and also affecting the national economies for countries that depend on tourism. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in Kenya, for example, has meant that 10% of the country's GDP is heavily negatively impacted. $1.64 billion of tourism income that Kenya earns every year is no longer going to be in our budget for the next 12 months. That's a significant gap. Tourism also comprises more than 50% of the income that is used to manage national parks and reserves. With only operating at half its potential, this is not good for wildlife. This is not good news. And also within the communities, 80 to 90% of the tourism income received in conservancies really go into conserving wildlife, supporting rural livelihoods, employing rangers, which in our country more than 3,000, improving the security of people and livestock, and also wildlife. And therefore, with this pandemic, we face a significant risk as countries that depend on tourism are likely to be destabilized, both in terms of conservation and also in terms of security. In conservancies specifically, across Africa, we've seen many communities and private landowners setting aside land to protect and capture benefits from wildlife. These conservancies have become really important in empowering the communities in rural areas. In Kenya, the community conservancies earn about $12 million every year from tourism. And that really is important income to incentivize these communities to support the government initiatives to protect wildlife, but as well as improving their livelihoods. In the Mara, for example, which is one of our key landscapes, $7.5 million normally would, on a good tourism year, will go to the communities. This improves their ability to take their children to school, their ability to buy medical services, and even most importantly, their ability to feed their families in an area where most of the food stuff is imported in because they cannot grow crops because of elephants and other species. So the loss of tourism income threatens years of progress and recovery of elephants, black rhino, and other wildlife, which has been increasing in Kenya and also other parts of Africa. And there is therefore a need for financial support to be provided to frontline communities and conservancies who live alongside wildlife and who bear many of the impacts of the loss of this revenue. There is a high risk of losing ground on gains we have made over the last decade if community conservation efforts were to be impacted by this situation. In Kenya, for example, among our 160 conservancies, $12.7 million are required to support up to 50% of conservancy operations to keep the rangers on the ground and to keep them working. In areas where we have leases, conservation leases, for example, in the Mara, we need to support those leases so that 25 years of agreement between the landowners and communities are therefore sustained beyond the COVID situation. The US government has for decades supported community conservation across the continent. Again, we appreciate this support. During and post-COVID, emergency support through this pandemic will ensure that the gains that we've sustained and we've worked hard for will continue beyond this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dickson, for that rich overview. It certainly worries us when we hear that kind of impact, especially on local communities, given the work that has gone into building those conservancies. Hopefully we'll be able to hear more from you during the question and answer session. So now we'll move on to Shamini Jayathana. Shamini will help us look through what's happening in terms of the law enforcement space, illegal wildlife trade, and help to look at the situation on the ground and some of the issues that need addressing. Shamini, over to you.
Thank you, Edwin, and sincere thanks to those who facilitated this virtual briefing. It's very clear from what we've just heard from my fellow panelists that conservation efforts, some of which have been in place for decades, have very quickly succumbed in a matter of mere months to the effects of this pandemic, in particular due to their reliance on sources of funding outside of central government. What this tells us is that core funding, or perhaps a lack of it, is indicative of the priority that governments currently place on the protection of habitats and biodiversity, whatever their fine words. Many of these areas and even state authorities are being left to fend for themselves in delivery of core functions. Now, I'm going to talk about the criminal justice aspect in terms of combating illegal activities. That currently we're seeing an increase in forms of poaching, as we've heard, encroachment into protected areas and wildlife trafficking. Over 280,000 people have apparently died in the last 4 months, which according to some studies is higher than the number of people who've been killed in terrorist attacks over the last 10 years. If COVID is indeed linked to our exploitation of wildlife and habitat destruction, then these types of crimes must now be viewed as the worst types of crimes in the world and should be addressed with the same vigor that governments apply in combating terrorism. To that end, there are two main approaches. One is international and one is at a national level. Given the global impact, this is an opportune time to call for the following. In the short term, an immediate call for the banning of commercial wildlife trade. Governments are probably never more alive to the risks posed by such trade as they are now. And whilst preserving subsistence level consumption for indigenous peoples, we may just get the leadership required to make this happen. Secondly, there needs to be a call for the World Health Organization to revisit its blanket endorsement on the use of traditional medicines. That endorsement did not acknowledge the need for sustainability in sourcing ingredients or the impact on global health by the use of materials that are driving some species to the brink of extinction. Now is a particularly good time to demand that these be amended, given that there is some evidence that pangolins trafficked for their scales for use in medicines may have been involved in the transmission of this disease. And so that endorsement needs to be looked at again. Now, in the medium to long term, I agree with a number of calls to create an international convention concerning crimes against our abuses of the environment, including our oceans. Such crimes involve rampant corruption at the highest levels, and they require not only specialized investigative techniques and cross-border collaboration, but they also require specialist forensic and other expertise on the issues of identification of species, the measurement of impact, the types of restoration that might be required. Further, these types of crimes cross over into health and safety, food safety, regulation, and so on. And therefore, rather than be a poor cousin to arms, drugs, and human trafficking under the United Nations Convention Against Organized Crime, I would suggest this deserves its own place as a standalone convention. Now, in making these calls on an international level, we have to acknowledge that there are limitations on the effectiveness of such agreements. They must be domesticated, and that requires leadership at a national level. At present, our efforts in building capacity in the criminal justice chain are not having the desired effect of deterring such crimes. The reason is that the problems that plague, let's say, a wildlife trafficking case at trial, from progressing through the courts to its conclusion, are the same problems that prevent robbery, murder, sexual violence themselves also progressing swiftly and fairly through the courts. At present, we are reliant on the personal motivation of individuals to implement what they've learned through trainings that they've received from various donors. We're not getting the institutionalizing of good practice through the adoption, for example, of performance targets, core competencies and performance appraisals, promotion pathways, that kind of thing. That requires leadership from both the heads of those agencies, but also from governments themselves to make the required resources available, particularly to the prosecution and judicial services, who so far, in many of the countries that I work with, are sorely under-resourced. There are 3 prongs that I would recommend that we focus upon at a domestic level. The first is to bolster strong prosecutions. When we focus only upon tip-offs and seizures, we're only going to achieve a temporary disruption rather than a long-term deterrent. Strong prosecutions start with the time and resources to properly review cases that are brought for charge. Many prosecutors I meet across Africa don't have time to properly review cases before they charge them. They don't often get the early engagement with investigators so that they can guide and direct those investigations according to the requirements of the law. They don't even always have access to the legislation. Sometimes these can be quite obscure pieces of legislation. They need practical tools that they can use day in, day out. And most importantly, their directors need support to institutionalize that good practice. Secondly, we need to focus on trial without delay. The culture of adjournments in many courts across Africa is pervasive and thoroughly undermining. Criminal procedure rules and the use of technology are key. One positive aspect of this pandemic is the speed at which some courts in Kenya and Uganda have harnessed the use of video conferencing platforms for court hearings. This needs to be bolstered, institutionalized, as one of the main reasons for adjournments is the non-attendance of witnesses, often due to the distances and the cost involved. And 3, I would look at bringing in prescriptive and binding sentencing guidelines. There is currently no predictability or even proportionality sometimes when it comes to sentencing. Very often we see heavy fines with imprisonment only in default, which means the rich or well-connected will walk away. In other situations, we see huge disparity, such as a $100 US dollar fine in one court and an 11-year term of imprisonment for an identical offense in another court in the same country. Such unpredictability makes discussions on plea bargaining, cooperation, early guilty pleas in return for a reduction in sentence next to impossible. To focus on those sorts of changes, it means that we must move away from siloing our work into the themes of wildlife, drugs, money laundering, etc., in order to improve the criminal justice pathway as a whole. At present, those involved in offences know that they actually have very little to fear. That has to change, and very quickly, or we will be facing this situation again and again as our margin for error in the abuse of our environment gets thinner and thinner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamini. That was really rich, and quite a number of propositions you made. Hopefully, we can follow through and look into some of those issues. So now we'll move into a Q&A session. I'll hand over to Susan. She will help move us through the question and answer session. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Edwin, and thank you to all the panelists. That was a lot of information and really excellent information. So just to review the rules for the Q&A, those on the Zoom call, please use the raise hand option if you have a question, or you can chat with me privately. Those on the live stream, please identify who you are as well when you submit your questions, and I will be able to see those questions. So starting with the live stream, starting with the Zoom call, do I have questions for the panelists? Please raise hands if you have a question. Would anyone like to start with a question? I am going to turn it back to Edwin, who actually has several questions. He will start. Edwin, if you'd like to ask your questions.
Thank you, Susan. Hopefully we can get questions coming in from our Zoom participants as well as from the chat. Minister Lee, I want to start with you. One of the questions we had coming from the audience was, where do you see U.S. funding for law enforcement assistance related to illegal wildlife trade being most effective? Where do you see that funding being most effective from what you see happening on the ground?
I think where U.S. funding makes the most difference is where there's a very strong political will to use that money appropriately and to deal with wildlife crime. If you look across Africa, it's the countries where you have the political will that you can really make progress and use money efficiently to raise capacity, to buy the equipment that may be under-equipped. Wildlife police forces need to be able to do their job. But if you don't have the political commitment, it's not going to work. You're not going to get those prosecutions that Shamini is talking about.
Thank you very much. I think you are spot on. Political will is really ideal to such an area which, as Shamini pointed earlier, has issues of corruption, and you'd certainly need the high level buy-in to ensure that you deal with some of those issues. Shamini, it probably touching on some of the things you highlighted earlier, one of the things we have seen probably that's still lacking is coordination at a continental level. So from a policy perspective, what do you think are some of the inconsistencies that exist, and how can this be ironed out to ensure that some of the things that you pointed out are actually effective once they are established?
Legislation already exists across the vast majority of countries in which I work, criminalizing most of the offenses that we're talking about. This is really a question of implementation, and that really does come down to political will. We have seen that some countries are very capable and quick to enact, to take action where there is that will. And ironically, this has been China. In the last few years, they have taken down 2 major networks, resulting not just in the arrest and seizure, but the actual prosecution, conviction, and sentence. So when they are motivated, they do it. And I think the same can be said of many of the countries in source countries and transit countries. There needs to be the political will. Some of the barriers to cross-border collaboration may be issues relating to the laws on mutual legal assistance and extradition. But very often those we can get around those through the use of memorandums of understanding or treaties. It'd be far quicker to do that than to think about legislation and changes in policy. So on a case-by-case basis, if there is political will, then there shouldn't be any obstacle.
Thanks, Shamini. Susan, you have some questions coming in.
Yes, excuse me for interrupting, Edwin. Yes, we do have quite a few questions coming in now. This is for Sam. This is from Muthwana Methodius from African Wildlife Foundation in Uganda. The question is, one of the biggest challenges is meeting the services that the authority was offering. Which sectors has the authority prioritized now that working is halved? Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Methodius. What we are focusing on at Uganda Wildlife Authority is to ensure that we undertake our law enforcement seriously, because as we cut down on activities, we need to ensure that the protected areas are safe for the wildlife and ready to receive visitors immediately the pandemic is over, because visitors come to see and they must find the wildlife there. So that is one aspect, law enforcement, and that ensures that there is no encroachment, that there is no poaching, that we deal with the illegal wildlife trade. Then the second aspect is to deal with our neighbors, the communities. The wildlife, as I said earlier, do not care about the borders of the protected areas. And so they move out, they damage gardens, they kill livestock, and we must be available to support the communities to ensure that their livelihood is not destroyed. So what we do is to address the human-wildlife conflicts as soon as they are reported to us. And we have a very good relationship with the communities. They are able to report, and when they have reported, we dispatch staff that go there and ensure that the wildlife is pushed back into the protected areas as quickly as possible and as with little damage as possible. So that those are the areas we are focused on. And the bigger aspect is that we must keep the staff, because the staff must do the work. We must pay their salaries. We must pay their food ration. When they go to work in the field, they need to eat. So they carry food along with them, because sometimes they stay days away. And so we must keep that. And that's where we are focusing on doing the work in all our protected areas to ensure that when COVID is over, we have a resource to sell to the tourists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have Congressman Jeff Fortenberry, who just joined us, co-chair of the International Conservation Caucus. I'd like to give Congressman Fortenberry an opportunity to speak with us. Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us.
Good morning, Susan, and good morning, everyone. I'm sorry to join you a little bit late, so I don't have the full benefit of the conversation. So I want to just perhaps say a few words of encouragement and further our solidarity and sense of mission together. Sam, as I was just listening to you a bit, it's got to be very difficult. Obviously, the parks and the conservancies and the whole wildlife protection movement and community sustainability ideals depend so much upon visitors. And with everything at a standstill and uncertain, and it will not rebound immediately, you can't throw a switch on and off to these things. It will take some time. It's got to be quite difficult to maintain the integrity of the mission. So thank you all, particularly those of you in Africa who are dedicated to this work. I do think there's an untold story here. If Susan, if you allow me to reflect on that for just a moment. As Susan mentioned, I'm the chair of the International Conservation Caucus in the Congress, one of the largest bipartisan gatherings, platforms that exist. And the reason that it's bipartisan and large is that the ideas here are imaginative. They're in a certain sense mythical. Africa has a mystique, if you will, the idea of pristine wild places that are well managed ecologically and that are available for a person's use in harmony with the communities who live there and sustain them. This is the architecture for the 21st century. It's not only the idea, but moving from the abstract idea of, again, a sustained regenerative community that somehow lives, manages its wildlife to person's conflict and actually gets beyond the idea of conflict. Sorry, my wife peeked at me. That's why my eyes moved because I'm in my house. So if you hear a dog in the background and children, I'm sorry. It's just what we're all living with these days. So, but the idea here of a sustainable, regenerative economy that looks at the appropriate stewardship use of land and wildlife resources for the benefit of persons, but also to protect them for the regenerative value. Actually, it touches the heart and soul of what I think most people are longing for in terms of a new type of economic vision where no person, no thing is ever thrown away. And so the conservation movement, the protection of wildlife in parks, these are all specific, tangible outcomes of a deeper philosophical idea that has yet to see fruition. And I think the International Conservation Caucus Foundation and the caucus inside of Congress and African Parks and all of your good work, if we can continue to consolidate those concepts and push forward a vision while making it practical with certain things on the ground that don't destroy that vision before we have a chance to realize it, then I think this whole work takes a decided place in the forefront of the consciousness of the world. It's already there. It just needs to be activated. So those of you who are on the ground, again, during this trauma of coronavirus and the crisis that's occurred in terms of drop of tourism, plus the health impacts upon your own communities, let's all keep an eye on this bigger vision once we get past this, because we may be able to accelerate very rapidly to a new place where this conversation isn't sort of a sideline ideal, but it is fully integrated into our foreign aid dynamics. It is fully integrated as to how we think about appropriate economic planning and how we allow for that entrepreneurial space of individuals to leverage this gift of wildlife and natural spaces for their own economic well-being while preserving it for themselves in the future. That's what you call a smart economy. That's what you call moving away from where we resource extraction, where we're just taking and making and wasting, to one where we're regenerating. The world is longing for this, and there are many Africans on the call today. I think Africa can play a clear lead role. It just needs to be branded, projected, and made whole by, again, being a part of the balance sheet. Just like any accounting methodology, these social metric outcomes have to be a part of what we're looking at in terms of, if you will, profitability of the benefit of economic production. So again, Susan, thank you for letting me interject this. I just wanted to say those words to be in solidarity and friendship with you. As my friend David Barron, who is the principal in all of these efforts, says, Africa touches the soul. It's so true. The visits that I've had there have been just extraordinarily beautiful, not only in terms of the landscape, but again, the deep, deep sense of hospitality and longing for this commitment and solidarity around these higher ideals. No place, no thing, no person ever being thrown away. So thank you all for your good work. And again, I apologize, I'm gonna have to leave momentarily, but Susan, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Hang in there, work hard, everyone. We'll get past this virus. We're gonna all fight our way through it. And then again, it gives us the chance to rethink possibilities for the 21st century here along the lines in which you're doing today. Thank you for your good work.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for your leadership and your vision as always. So welcome. We're going to go back to questions now. We have quite a few coming in from the live stream. This one is for Lee, Minister Lee White from Vulcan, from Jess Lefcourt. The question is, Professor White, is there more political will to fund reactionary response to crime or proactive measures to prevent it?
I would say both. We obviously have to do both. We have to do the reactive part when we fail to do the preventive part. So at least in Gabon, I can't talk too much about political will elsewhere, but certainly in Gabon, I would say in the region of Central Africa, we're using all the tools we can, all the intelligence we can to be proactive and prevent crimes happening. But when they do happen, then we have a policy of zero tolerance. So both are important.
Thank you, Lee. This question is for all panelists. This is from SHAMINI, a lawyer. The question is, what alternatives can African countries adopt to reduce over-reliance on tourism for conservation post-COVID? I'm going to start with Dickson. Dickson, would you like to take a stab at this question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you for that great question. I think it's a question that is in everyone's mind, particularly at this moment. Again, I think that tourism has a chance to bounce back, and it's been a major force, and it's already, tourists to Africa is already a tiny small proportion of the tourists globally. And so I think there is still opportunities to grow the tourism value chain, and more importantly, to ensure that tourism benefits that are generated by visitors as they come is actually made available to those that suffer the actual cost of living with wildlife. But again, anything that relies on one particular income stream is not very sustainable. And so, again, we see in Kenya, for example, within the conservancies, there is already a lot of discussion that is going on other means of securing these spaces through government effort, through private sector, a very important role that private sector can play to create sustainable, scaled up enterprises that generate additional resources without compromising on the natural resources on the area. There are other means that exist today that particularly countries like the US are practicing: conservation easements, biodiversity offsets, carbon credits, wildlife credits. There are quite a number of other tools that needs to be, and they're already actually being practiced in various places. I think this COVID situation has outlined the importance of scaling those up and practicing it up in more places, and therefore reducing the reliance on tourism, but at the same time continuing to develop tourism when it bounces back.
Thank you. Dickson. Sam, would you like to answer this question?
Thank you, Susan. And just to add on what Dickson has said in response to Wenda's question, the issue of integration of various revenue streams is important. And actually, where Dickson comes from, Kenya, they have a conservancy there called Pejeta, which has mixed wildlife with agriculture and livestock farming. And there is a point at which they had issues with the terrorism and visitors literally stopped coming. And the conservancy was able to rely on the agriculture and livestock farming to actually continue running. So the mix of different investments is extremely important. In Uganda Wildlife Authority at the moment, we had a small plantation in one of our national parks. We have already focused on harvesting that plantation, sell off the timber to help us in the next financial year. So some of these are things that we need to look at and look at ways in which we can provide those alternatives and ensure that we are not depending on one revenue stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I think we are going to save the rest of the questions to be asked later. We have recorded them all, and we'll make sure that the questions that have been asked get to the proper panelists. I'm going to ask Edwin to wrap up, and then I will just come back on and say a few words. So Edwin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to our panelists. I think they highlighted in their presentations a number of issues as well as in their responses to the questions. I think some of the key things that came up were the need to consider the impact of some of the proposed bans on indigenous peoples and local communities. What does that mean in terms of food security? So certainly as legislators are considering some of these policy decisions, there's need to listen in and really strategize on what could be alternative sources for food and protein for some of the communities that heavily rely on wildlife. But also, how do we stimulate rural economies, especially given COVID? How do we make sure that maybe we can look at supply chains as a way of stimulating rural economies and providing activity that can generate jobs for local communities? As Sam has indicated, there has already begun movement of people from cities that have probably lost jobs because of the shutdowns moving to rural areas. So that raises the need to actually create economic activity that is in harmony with conservation. As we know, in conservation, we have had the habit of playing catch up. How do we make sure that we stay at the front of this? So for me, stimulating economic activity in these rural areas is going to be key. And for us to make sure that the economic activity is in harmony with conservation is going to be key as well. With conservancies, how do we make sure that the gains we have made in generating a positive attitude from communities towards conservation is not lost? It is really critical. I think Dickson talked extensively about the impacts that conservancies face in Kenya, the impacts on the livelihood, talking of upwards of 5 million people that are going to be impacted. But as well as other countries like Namibia, you are talking of 86 conservancies that are going to lose almost $11 million worth of income. How do we make sure that those conservancies could possibly receive cover so that we do not lose the gains that have been made over the years? I think another key issue that has come up is how do we look at diversifying revenues for conservation? I think that's another key question that as we think about responding to COVID, how do we make sure that our responses are not just looking at the immediate, but how do we set up whatever structures and mechanisms we are going to put in place to respond for the long term, and certainly the whole aspect of financing for conservation needs to be considered. And there are some ideas that were already being applied in different parts of Africa, but they haven't gained momentum because maybe policy conditions are not conducive, or donors were hesitant to support those. So we probably need to bring more attention and more voices to some of those mechanisms, and certainly strengthen the position, the financing position. There was mention to probably the use of technology and innovation. I think Shamini pointed to how some of the cases, you would never think that during this time you would have court cases actually being sped up, but because there is opportunity to do this virtually, there has seen some sort of movement compared to when things were normal. So certainly we still need to look at where can we innovate and where can we bring technology on board to actually ensure that we leverage on some of these barriers that we have had in conservation. And I think certainly the key thing here is Africa, as Congressman said, Africa has the opportunity to show the world how you can develop a regenerative economy. And certainly we might be strapped for resources right now. I think that gives us the thinking space to rethink our ways of development and how we are planning our development across the continent, and really look at how can we put nature at the center of our development agenda across the continent. So that's it from me, Susan, only to thank our panelists and all our participants, and really for the rich discussion, and hopefully we can take forward some of the thoughts and insights that came forward today, and always counting on the support that we get from the US for the support, whether in conservancies, in protected areas, in community livelihoods. We're really counting on that support moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. On behalf of ICCF, I want to say a special thank you to all of our panelists who are with us today, as well as everyone joining, and the questions that were very provocative. These issues are important to the International Conservation Caucus and important to the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. We are hosting a series of these briefings. This is the third. We will continue to do many more virtual, and then at one point in the near future, hopefully go back to actually having them in person. But I think we all realize that this is a wonderful opportunity to be able to still be together. We count on all of you on the panel and all of you who are on the live stream to continue giving us good information so we can support the International Conservation Caucus with the kind of information they need to make the decisions that they need to make. So again, let this be the beginning of the conversation, certainly not the end. And I was asked just now by WhatsApp to give regards to everyone from Senator Coons. These issues are so dear to his heart. He wasn't able to join us. He said a special hello to DICKSON and to SHAMINI, with whom he had the opportunity to learn firsthand in Kenya. So again, to everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you again very soon. Over and out. Thank you.